So good morning. Welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to have and welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Leslie Harris, who was the wonderful impetus for transforming community project that was here at Emory University before my time here. I'm Dr. Carol Henderson, Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer and Advisor to the President. And Emory is on a journey now. We have a symposium that will take place September 29th in the evening, September 30th and October 1st. Entitled In the Wake of Slavery and Dispossession. And that symposium will look at Emory's history and its relationship with its own legacy with slavery and dispossession of Native and Indigenous people, people of African ancestry, as well as looking at how that journey impacts the ways in which we engage with each other in our current time. Given what has gone on in our country, racial awakening, Dr. Harris has been a vocal and very present, excellent scholar in that space when we think about monuments and what we attend to and what we honor in this country. We want to take a step back to think about a time before this symposium, 10 years ago in 2011, I believe, with the Transforming Community Project. It was something that I heard a lot about when I arrived here at Emory. It made an imprint and left an indelible mark, and I think people are still grieving it. And so I wanna get to know what that is. We thought it would be great to have this conversation be one of the pre-recorded sessions before the symposium to kind of set the stage, this context. So Dr. Harris, thank you so much for being here today and for giving us your time. I just want to start with the first question. What was the impetus for creating TCP? That's what it's affectionately known as. And what did it build upon? What were the goals? What were the voids it filled? And what impact did you hope it would have? And I realize that I'm asking a lot of questions and we'll take them one at a time. And also, I realized that you were leading a movement, and so there were other people involved with this, but you were definitely one of the inspirations of that. So if you let's start there.
That's a great way to start. And I want to say before I get started, thank you for inviting me back. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm appreciating the technology that allows us to have this conversation regardless. I have to say the impetus was a negative one, as unfortunately is often the case when we turn to do this kind of work. But what happened in the aftermath of really a year of negative events that I'll just very briefly talk about was that I learned, and many of us learned, that we had a lot of resource in the community and we were not directing it to being proactive in addressing issues of diversity, primarily race. So in the fall of, I believe it was 2003, there was a celebration of 25-year anniversary, I think, of the anthropology department. And one of the faculty members used the N-word in a public address. And this, that is seen for the general community as the impetus for protests. But I want to unpack that event because there was a young Black woman assistant professor in the audience for whom that was the last straw. And she then filed a report with the EEOC office, not about the language, but about her experience in that department and not getting what she needed to mount her research agenda. She needed a lab, she needed space, and she had not gotten that at the same rate as a white male faculty member who had joined and who was at the same time and who was at her level. Mm-hmm. So I want to emphasize that to say that for many, and even today, we focus on these language moments, but often the explosion that comes around something like that is part of something deeper in the culture that is not right. That if someone is going to be upset, and the other thing to say is that when this professor used that, no one blinked, no one said anything. And in fact, it wasn't until a month later that people began protesting. So if you think about a community witnessing something that maybe is upsetting, but at least should be discussed in terms of the use of this word, and then this young faculty member, assistant professor, untenured, feeling like she has to go to the EEOC to get her research needs met, and feeling that there's a racial and gender disparity, there's a lot more going on than just that one incident.
Indeed.
We didn't necessarily know all of that at the time. That came out later over the course of the year. So there was a big march when news of this event spread on the campus. There's a march led by graduate students, and it led to a town hall in the chapel, and our then very new president presided over that town hall to hear more about, he had been there maybe 2 months. And in addition to the students speaking up, 2 white male faculty members spoke up and said, we don't need, what did they call it, diversity training. We don't, faculty don't need these kinds of things. So it felt very, not very constructive at that moment.
Right.
But those 2 faculty members then wrote, all the Black faculty had signed a letter, and this is mostly within the college, had signed a letter about these events. And those 2 white men then wrote a letter to the Black faculty saying, this is not the Emory we recognize. The charges that there's systemic racism, that people of color don't feel comfortable on campus. And because they came back and asked for conversation, for explanation, a small group of us began meeting together. Just anyone who was interested, some of the signers of the letter, other faculty, non-Black, white faculty. It was a really diverse group. Asian, Donna Wong, who was in charge of multicultural student services at the time. Very diverse group, mostly faculty, some administrators, some students, trying to figure out, how did we understand working and being in community on this campus? Did we have the same knowledge base? Did we understand the history even? And I don't even mean way back history. I mean like even yesterday history.
Yes.
Like, as some would say, when I arrived on the campus, it felt like this. And not only from Black faculty, white faculty who also talked about witnessing acts of racism over their time. And so we just began to have this really honest conversation about what is racial diversity, what we would say in today's language, this is the language that changed over the time of the TCP. What do we mean by equity? What do we mean? You could even say, what do we mean by integration? All of these terms, like what does it mean to have a racially diverse campus where people are really thriving and where their work is respected? This conversation happened at the same time that there were just a series of events that whole year. It was one of the most difficult years I'd ever had at Emory in terms of, I won't rehearse all of them, but one thing I'll also note is that one of the people who eventually joined our group did a series of town halls with staff. And it was during my time at the TCP that I realized that as a faculty member, I was in the minority as a non-white woman. But if you go to any staff meeting, and that is completely reversed.
Yes.
So staff members turned out for her meetings to express their experience. And that was eye-opening for many of us who were faculty in terms of the ways that they felt disrespected. And I would say, sometimes it was through a racial lens, but also a very hierarchical lens too, I think is part of the issue. So this was for those of us who participated in these conversations, it was an incredible year in a lot of ways. And it became a place that as things kept going, that we felt we could say, why did that happen yesterday? Or did you hear about? And we really wanted to do something constructive. How do we get these ideas? How do we get the experience actually that we were having of really concretely talking with each other and being honest with each other about where we agreed and disagreed about the experience of being at Emory, what we could do to make it better. And so I and my colleague, Catherine Manigault, who was then the James Cox Professor of Journalism, came up with this idea, 2 interrelated but separate ideas. My idea was community dialogues that people would just meet over a meal and have these same kind of conversations, but rooted in actual history and experience. So not just talking about, I feel this way or this happened to me, but understanding the longer history of these experiences. So then we could come to some understandings of how what seemed to be anecdotal things were part of sometimes longer, bigger issues, structural issues, historical issues, ways of doing things that continued regardless of how many people came into the institution. And then we hope that that would give people practice in articulating the problem, in diagnosing the problem, and then in searching for solution. And then Catherine was interested in, I think we called it something like recovering the record, but digging into the history and really making the history available so that people could see where we had been, where we were going, but also thinking about, and we didn't get very far with this, but also thinking about contemporary things that were happening. And how do we talk about the incident that happened yesterday? How do we publicize that as well? Not in a way to use these as teachable moments, if you will. So that this was happening, this discussion happened as Earl Lewis, who many of you know as a national figure, and of course a very big figure in Emory's history, came to campus as the first Black provost. And he took these ideas and said, well, why don't you explore this? And think about it, gave us some little seed money. And we spent the next year meeting with different constituencies on campus, fleshing out the ideas. And then we had a retreat in the spring of the following year. I guess that would be the spring of 2005, right? Where we went to Commonwealth Gardens and just hammered out what this would look like, just the big structure. A group of, I don't know if it was 40, 50, again, faculty, staff, students, administrators, it was great. And then Catherine left for another position, and I and a group of amazing people, Bobby Patterson, who's in the religion department, Gary Hawk, who I think has recently, I'm not sure if he's retired as, the historian of Emory. At that time, he was the secretary to the president. Again, Donald Long from Campus Services, Jennifer Crabb, I think Jennifer Crabb Kyle now from Alumni Relations. Anyway, it was a great diverse group. We met over the summer to figure out what should the syllabus for these community dialogues be. And then I had some ideas about how to do we called it out of the retreat, gathering the tools, a seminar meeting for people who wanted to investigate the history of Emory and actually do research, and how it was a way both to get people to ask and answer questions about Emory's history, but also to think about how history happens. How do we find the evidence we need? So the first community dialogue, so we spent the summer putting together the syllabus, making sure that it would be accessible to a broad audience, different reading levels, time levels, all of those things. And then we had the first community dialogues in the fall of 2005. So that program continued through for 5 or 6 years. My original plan was that it would only be 5 years. I personally I have other things on my own personal agenda, my scholarly agenda. I didn't initially see this as an area of scholarship for me. At the same time, over that time, it was an incredibly generative, I used to think all the time, this is incredible work. I'll never do this again anywhere else. I have to say that one of the things about the Emory community and its history and traditions and its location in Atlanta and the people who were drawn there is that there was incredible resource actually in the community around these issues of diversity, around thinking about how to create community. It came from all kinds of places. My co-director, Jody Usher, who many people know, had spent, was an Emory alum from the 60s, got her PhD in psychology at Emory also, had been an administrator in different parts of the university, had retired, and then made the mistake of taking me out for lunch And 6 months later, I asked her to join me because I knew she had deep expertise and even more so had cultivated her own wisdom.
Yes.
You know, she had really sought out thinking about how do we create community? How do we connect across these divides? How do we have these difficult conversations? And I knew she, with her heart, would balance my head, if you will. It was also important that she was different from me generationally. She's a white woman from the South. I'm a Black woman from the South, you know, all of those things. And so we really tried to model in our leadership and as we put together peer facilitators for the community dialogues, as we brought together groups to think about whether or not what we were doing to participate, we really wanted to model not just racial diversity, but intergenerational, interhierarchical. So what would a peer facilitation group look like with a student and a staff member? So really thinking about how do we think across the many different kinds of diversity that are in these communities. It was, again, it was and still is some of the most incredible work I've ever done.
Yes, amazing.
Just as a person, just as a human being. So, and I have to say that that's part of the amazing people who make up the community of Emory that I got to meet in these spaces.
Yes, so thank you so much for that. And, you know, I'm sitting here while you were speaking, I said, oh, this is a book. This is sure enough a book. You said the scholarly endeavor, just to talk about the impetus of that, because I don't think we have enough conversation right now. And sometimes that conversation can be very toxic instead of thoughtful. It can be very polarizing. And in many ways, we need to model what we do in classrooms in the larger campus community. And so you're giving me some ideas of what I think, since 3 of the areas we're focusing on in our office, Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, are professional development, education, awareness, because we see those as distinct areas, professional developing, also education, but also just an awareness, cultural literacy, building those intercultural competencies and muscle to engage and transform climate and culture, which is the second area on our campus, and then holding ourselves accountable so that the young woman who came in and was not being equitably treated in her department does not have to use a moment like this, transform, to be that gauge. And I think, you know, in answering the other part of questions, that the void it filled, obviously there were some holes in our accountability process at Emory that needed to be addressed, that this made kind of revealed, and the courage of that young woman to come forward, because I want people to realize what you said. You said she was untenured. So there were a lot of things she had to consider in that moment. And so do that courage in helping to create space for not only dialogue, but transformational. So we move beyond the transactional. That's my hashtag, I think, for the next 4 years for us, is moving from transactional to transformational. And the fact that this TCP uses that word, because transformation is a continuous process. It is not a fixed process, and it gets uncomfortable. You can't get better if you're not getting uncomfortable. So what do you see and hope the legacy of TCP would be, and how do you believe our current symposium will build upon that work?
Well, I want to pick up on a few things you said. That we started the project, the name comes from exactly what you said, this idea of transformation, and that college, higher education institutions are constantly transforming. And some of these transformations we accept and acknowledge. The classes are going to graduate, faculty are going to retire, people are going to move on. And some we have to work at. And the major transformation in higher education in the post-World War II era is, who is higher education for? And we are still struggling through and living through that transformation. And that's a transformation both in terms of who comes to these institutions, but the institutions have to transform as well. And there should be a lot of robust discussion and debate, but what there can't be is a stop sign. And I think the last couple of years of the pandemic demonstrate the need, not for the continued exclusion, but the continued inclusion of more people. We need more educated people. We need people to understand the scientific method better than they do. We need people to understand how change happens, historical change happens. We need people to understand how political and social change happens. Frankly, I felt the past couple of years for me, even as an historian, have been another deep dive into how does the government work again? Could you tell me how the government works? Because I thought I knew, but clearly I did not know enough. And that is a necessary part of, it should be at every level, of course, but clearly we need more at the BA, MA, PhD level to help us. So transformation has to be part of everything we do. I used to say, if you don't engage in transformation, you will be whipped around by the transformation. Amen. And you want, in terms of your institutions, you want not resistance, not rigidity as transformation happens, but resilience, engagement. And so I think that was something we sought to give people tools to be able to engage in thoughtful change, because change is the condition. It is our human condition.
It is.
I think another thing that we try to get across during the TCP is the difference between discomfort and unsafe. And so in conversations, we had guidelines for engagement that we talked about at the beginning of every community dialogue. And those became a way for people to think about how they engage with each other in these sessions. And they became a touchstone if people were feeling uncomfortable or feeling that the guidelines were not being adhered to, but not as a weapon to shut people down. But I think just having a sense of what are we here for? We're here to engage in self-transformation. We recognize that not everyone is at the same level. We want to participate, but we also want to give space for others. We want to listen as well as communicate. All of these ideas were in the guidelines. And there was also a clarity that if you feel that your group is not in a good space and you feel like you've run out of options with your peer facilitators, come talk to Leslie and Jody. We will. And I'll say we didn't have many people doing that because we did train the peer facilitators. They had participated in community dialogue, so they had a sense of a vision or developed a vision about what that process should look like. So it's not like we had a lot of people who felt they couldn't handle the process, but we did want people to be conscious of what they were trying to create. I think these ideas are still necessary. I'm not sure that a TCP is the way to do it per se, but
can I follow up on that? Why do you think TCP is not, just following up on what you said?
I think it's hard to, sometimes it's hard to recreate something. That's one thing. I think, well, let me back up. I want to go back and pick up on something else you said, was that TCP was created in the absence of. So many people felt that our EEOC office was not proactive. And after TCP was created, not that TCP had anything to do with this was right around the time when people were getting the kinds of positions like you hold. We had Vice Provost of Community and Diversity, our first. Right. But we were, everyone was starting to do that. And now it's some director of equity, the name changes, but
it has.
That's very different from an EOC office, which is more of a policing function. If something goes wrong, you bring a problem, as opposed to someone whose job it is to facilitate change, to facilitate function, to facilitate literacy around these issues. So I feel like we were in a stopgap moment. The structure is good. It does build on the traditions of the university. I definitely drew on my skills as a teacher. As I said, Jody Usher brought skills from other, the National Coalition Building Institute, for example. So I do think it can be difficult to recreate something like that. I also think, frankly, that it worked for that time, but my question to Emory is, what's next?
Yes.
I want to go back to the young woman who brought her concerns.
Mm-hmm.
She did not stay at Emory. She did not even stay in that department.
Wow.
So she was untenured and she did not gain tenure at Emory. And I know that that's because of what happened. In my own experience at Emory as a faculty member, there were certain ways in which my ideas, particularly around this, were accepted, but my academic leadership was not. As chair of African American Studies at that time, we could not get our ideas for being a stronger department heard. I know that that may have changed now, but
oh, it has. It has. I'm happy about that. Yes, and we can talk about that later.
So my, my question, and in the history department, I sort of went to African American Studies, not because the history department was actively hostile, but it was passively, what's the word?
Passive is a good word to use. Apathetic is another word I would use.
It was passive and limited in its vision of what I could bring academically, how I could contribute to the excellence of the department, not only in my academic work, but in a vision for what and who should be doing history, both graduate students and faculty, in terms of admissions of graduate students and in terms of hiring of faculty. So those kinds of issues are not going to be addressed by a TCP.
No, they're not.
They have to be addressed by some, and so for me, even as much as we did incredible work with the TCP, for me as a faculty member, as an academic, as someone interested in scholarship, I still saw a lot of limits to who was valued in the institution, to what kind of knowledge production was valued in the institution. Emory is a place that has a lot of money, and so it can create silos for people to do their work, and that work not affect the larger vision of who Emory is.
That's right.
So that was part of the limits of TCP. But I would say, and I'm speaking from the academic side, but I would say even from the staff side, I wonder, our largest numbers of participants were staff. And even for staff, I wonder how much the work that we did moved from personal transformation to institutional transformation. And I know there was a lot of personal transformation. I know individual people felt more empowered, but you still have to have someone hear you and be willing to say, I see that you have grown in this way. Do you individually want to be promoted to something? Do you want to work on a larger project that's not only about you, but is about this institution? And those are the questions that I feel a TCP can only partially address. And that takes a lot more, than a program run at that time by a new associate professor.
Yes. who was transformative even in that work. And I will say, if, thinking of Sankofa as a principal and thinking how we tap into the ancestral line, TCP paved the way for my position. I mean, when I don't think my position would have just happened had not the energy of the campus been about change in that area, and understanding that in order to get exactly what you said, the answers to that, you have to transform leadership and you have to hold leadership accountable. Right. And put someone who can, so I often see my role, the gift that I have is over 2 decades of teaching in the professoriate. And knowing the kind of what I would call the potholes and the kind of the detours that can happen when you're trying to engage change, and how people can passively tell you, yes, we're going to be about that, and never move the agenda. And so, with us doing, we're engaged in an institutional strategic planning process, which had not happened, where we actually have a plan that says we're gonna look at career pathing, we're gonna look at faculty diversity, we're gonna look at it in these particular areas, we're gonna talk about intersectionality, we're gonna talk about accountability and climate and culture, and our different systems of accountability and consistency and equity, and how, for lack of a better word, adjudication is done in certain instances, and realize that when we invite someone to our campus, it is our responsibility to create room for their success. Full stop. It's not optional. And I'm in conversations with my colleagues who I have a heart for change. Their willingness, I think, is very much tied to what their performance metrics are on our campus of what success looks like. And so, when you say transforming community project, we're still in that moment. It may not be called transforming community project, but we're in a process where we're trying to transform community in ways that help us to live up to our full potential. If we are going to be that institution that moves from excellence to eminence, in some areas we need to just move up to excellence. We can't get to eminence without hitting that first platform. And so what does that look like when we create a community of thriving for all individuals, where they can bring their whole selves to the campus community? And I really believe that, and really, staying anchored on what our mission is, which is to create, preserve, teach, and apply knowledge in the service to humanity. And my comment has always been, but we have to take care of the humanity on our campus first before we go out to impact the world. And so, that's the legacy for me of TCP, because it is anchored in all of those principles and values that we know as faculty. What happens in a classroom when people get in conversation? We know what happens when they're given the space to think, to be vulnerable, to grow, evolve, to be in pain and step back and then come back again, but not to harm. And and that's the tension there. And I think when I think of our current symposium, those are some of the takeaways. I think, when I think of transformation, because we have faculty, staff, and students participating in this. And of course, TCP paved the way for us to belong to the university studying slavery. We finally did it, Dr. Harris. We are there and we belong. I know that was a long journey for during your time. And so,
well, it wasn't though. I was one of the we were one of the founders of
yes, but
the conference of university studying slavery. We were on the list, so I'm not sure what
happened there. Yes, that's what everyone keeps asking, what happened when we were one of the founding institutions, and now we officially have recapitulated that, even though we know we were the founding. So oftentimes that has to do with what people's priorities are and where they are. But again, going to African American Studies under the wonderful leadership of Dr. Carol Anderson, who always acknowledges you being, having been in that seat before, but their departmentship and the fact that they are now in the process of creating a PhD program, which is amazing. And so there are a lot of things that have to happen with that. And when I say have to happen, when we bring people on the campus, we're going to still make sure this is a space of thriving. Just moving bodies does not transform culture. Exactly. And so if I were, and we're coming up on the end, if I were to ask you about pearls of wisdom, thinking about next step, because you gave us a charge about what TCP could do and what the institution's responsibility, and rightfully so, and that's a wonderful charge between individual and institutional transformation. If you have pearls of wisdom that you would want to give to those who will be watching this, who will be going into the symposium thinking about that title of restorative justice and acknowledging acknowledging what Emory's legacy is, and then what their role is in that legacy. Because when we belong to Emory, either as an administrator, as a faculty member, as a student, it's all a part of our journey. As that, we don't get a chance to sit on the outskirts and say this is Emory, but we have to be a part of that change.
Yeah. So I think the fear with diversity work, with expanding the range of people who are involved in an institution of higher education, with taking an elite, let's be clear, a university that not only is elite, but has strived to be in the top, pick a number, top 25, I think it is now, top 15, top whatever it is.
Yes, 21.
So when you take an institution like that and say, now we want to expand, there's a fear that those who've been in power will lose as the newer people come in. What I learned through the Transforming Community Project is to step away from the fear of having the hard discussion, to step away from the fear of expanding the range of ideas, to step away from the fear of new people. And when we share these spaces, when we share the power, when we share the knowledge production, we do grow stronger. We do reach excellence. This is not only me speaking pie in the sky. This has been proven. Corporate America has studied this issue and proven this. The US Army has studied this issue and proven that greater diversity leads to greater strength, greater outcomes, broader knowledge, greater ideas. Right now, what we're going through with the resurgence of white supremacy, with the dangers to our political systems, with the COVID pandemic, demonstrates the need for all hands on deck. Mm-hmm. Wherever their deck is, yes. Everyone needs to be energized around these issues. And so we need to recognize that the opportunities, the pie is not limited. It's not just one pie. There's a lot of pie.
Yes.
The pie is not limited and the need is unlimited. And we need to activate everyone. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone wants to be college president or everyone wants to be a professor, but everyone at whatever job they want to do, at whatever occupation they do, whatever family they want to raise, everyone there's room for all of us. And I think stepping away from the protective selfishness and opening up instead to the possibility, stepping away from the fear of the work of diversity and opening up to the possibility. For many of us in academia, feelings get hurt, but it's something else if because of the fear of feelings, you stop someone's career or refuse to self-examine how the leadership you wield is harming the growth of something that could be incredible. So that would be my charge is to really think much more broadly and expansively about what's possible.
Mm-hmm. That is beautiful. And it just reminds me, I was in a conversation with someone, and what I stated was diversity has always been a part of the human experience. We don't all look, we don't even have the same DNA. Even twins don't have the same, from what I realized, my limited experience connected to biology. And when I think about diversity, when we don't have it, it's because we as human beings have done exactly what you said, created systems that are the progenitors of barriers that prevent us from realizing the beautiful humanity that we have and that wonderful experience. And so the hope for me is that just as human beings created those barriers, we can dismantle them. And that is the work we have to do. And it's necessary work. We don't have an option for it right now, or else we either gonna live together or perish together. And that's about where we are right now.
Literally necessary to our survival.
Literally. I mean, and so I'm hopeful. I have a colleague who said, these days she's finding a hard time finding hope, But I really believe we have to be that which we want to see in the world. It's going to be hard work, but we have to be that person.
Definitely.
Yes.
And
So
we have to provide the space so people can
yes,
do that.
yes, indeed.
And that's what higher education should be.
That is what it is. And so, wow, what an honor it has been to share this moment with you and have this wonderful conversation. It's one that we will keep and use as we continue to do the work of institutional transformation, as we continue to build a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive Emory, as we continue to use equity mindedness, looking at patterns for change. And so thank you for the work you did.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate and the work you are doing.
Always has to be someone else. There is no one person for the work. There are many.
Right.
And I'm so glad that you're there.
Yes, thank you. I am riding on the wind that you created here. So again, appreciate you. I hope your semester goes well. And we'll look forward to seeing you and engaging you with the Emory community whenever that opportunity presents itself. Take good care of yourself, please.
Thank you.
Ms. Harris. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.